The problem we're trying to solve here is to count the number of times we need to roll 5 dice to get a Yahtzee. 5 dice might seem a little bit too complicated, so a good idea is to start simple. Let's assume we're only rolling 2 dice for now, and the goal is to count and return the number of rolls we need until we get those 2 dice to match. Once we figure out the code for that, we can then modify it and add more dice to it and solve the actual problem. When writing code for a complicated problem, it's always a good idea to break it down that way. Think of an abstract or simple version of the problem, write the code you need to solve that, and then build on that code till you solve the actual problem you have. To count the number of rolls needed for 2 dice to match, we will be declaring this function called keepRolling. It doesn't take any input arguments, and it returns an integer value, which is the number of rolls needed. To simulate the dice rolling, we'll be using the function rollDice that we've created in the previous lesson. RollDice returns a random number between 1 and 6, which basically simulates rolling a dice. Here we're calling it twice and setting them into the variables dice1 and dice2. Then I'll declare another integer variable here that will keep track of the number of rolls. I'll initialize it to 1 because so far we've rolled those 2 dice once. Next, we need to keep re-rolling our dice every time they don't match. We could use a while loop that checks if the dice don't match and then re-rolls the dice inside. That is, while dice1 and dice2 are not equal, then we want to retry rolling our dice and hope for a match. So inside our while loop, we'll just call this rollDice function again for dice1 and dice2 and add 1 to count this extra roll that we did. Remember that we only add 1 here because those 2 calls simulate rolling those 2 dice just once. Eventually, at some point, those 2 rolls would return the same value, and dice1 would match dice2, and this while loop would end. At that point, we could safely return the number of counts that we've counted so far, which would indicate the number of rolls we needed to get that match. That looks pretty good. Let's trace that code with some examples and see if it works. So the first thing that happens here is we call this rollDice function and save its return value in dice1. Let's say that randomly returned the number 4. The next line calls rollDice again for dice2. Let's say that returned 2. So dice1 has 4 in it and dice2 has 2 in it. And then we initialize the count variable to 1, and then we go to our while condition. It's checking if dice1 and dice2 are not the same. In this case, 4 and 2 are not the same, so our loop condition is true, which means we step inside our loop and we re-roll our dice, calling rollDice twice again and updating the dice values 1 and 2. So let's say this time dice1 became 6 and dice2 became 5. And then after that, we add 1 to our variable count, updating it to become 2 instead of 1. We reach the closing brackets of the while loop, so we go back up, and then we perform this comparison again. Are dice1 and dice2 not the same? Well, 6 and 5 are not the same, so that's true. So we step inside our loop again, and we update dice1 and dice2 using the rollDice again. Let's say this time we got 2 and 3. We add 1 to the count again, updating it to 3. And then we go back up and perform our loop condition. We check if dice1 and dice2 are not the same, and 2 or 3 are not the same, so that's true, which means we step inside our loop again. And then we update dice1 and dice2 again. Let's say this time we get 1 and 1. And then we add 1 to our count, making it 4, which means that we've rolled our dice 4 times so far. And then we go back up and do our loop condition comparison. This time, dice1 and dice2 are the same, so this check here evaluates to false, which means our while loop is no longer going to step inside and just jump to the closed curly brackets here and continue the program. And since we only have this return count after the loop, so that means we return 4, basically stating that we needed 4 rolls of those 2 dice until we got a match. Now, can you think of what we need to change in this code here to make it work for 3 dice instead of 2?